At this very moment, billions of people across the world believe in the legacy of one man. Yet the story of Abraham does not begin with greatness in the way we typically understand it. He was not a king commanding armies, nor a warrior conquering nations, nor a prophet born in perfection. Instead, he was profoundly ordinary, marked by fear, capable of deception, and vulnerable to failure. He made decisions driven by survival, not always by courage. He hesitated, doubted, and at times stood on the edge of choices that could have led to devastating consequences. And yet, this is the very man chosen by God. This paradox is what makes Abraham's story so unsettling and so powerful. In a world that often equates greatness with strength, certainty, and moral perfection, Abraham stands as a contradiction. He represents a theological disruption, the idea that divine intikhab does not follow human standards. God does not choose the flawless, he chooses the willing. He does not select those who have already mastered faith. He forms faith within those who struggle. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel and following along. These explorations are not just about ancient figures, but about understanding the deeper patterns of faith, doubt, and transformation that still shape human life today. The central message emerges clearly from the beginning. Weakness is not a disqualification. In fact, it is often the very foundation upon which true faith is built. Abraham's fears did not exclude him from his calling. They defined the terrain on which his faith would grow. His imperfections did not undermine his story. They made it real, accessible, and transformative. This is not the story of a perfect man becoming great. It is the story of a broken, questioning human being who dares to keep moving forward, and in doing so, becomes a vessel for something far greater than himself. To understand Abraham's transformation, we must first understand the world that shaped him. He was born in the ancient city of Ur, a place renowned for its architectural brilliance, cultural sophistication, and economic vitality. On the surface, it was a thriving center of civilization. Towering structures dominated the skyline, and society appeared structured, organized, and stable. But beneath this impressive exterior lay a deeply troubling reality. Ur was not a place of spiritual freedom or truth. It was a society bound by fear, controlled by systems of belief that demanded submission rather than understanding. Religion, instead of being a source of illumination, functioned as an instrument of power. The people did not worship out of conviction, but out of obligation and anxiety. Their gods, crafted from clay and stone, were silent, lifeless, and powerless. Yet these idols held immense influence over the population, not because they were real, but because the system surrounding them was enforced by authority and tradition. This contradiction defined the environment in which Abraham was raised, a world where people believed deeply in what was fundamentally unreal. Even more striking is the role of Abraham's own family within this system. His father was a craftsman, an idol maker. He sculpted the very figures that people worshipped, shaping them with his own hands, fully aware of their artificial nature. And yet, despite knowing the truth, he remained dependent on the system. His livelihood, his social standing, and perhaps even his survival were tied to maintaining the illusion. This created a profound tension within the household, a life sustained by beliefs that were known, at some level, to be false. For Abraham, this environment was not neutral, it was formative. Growing up surrounded by contradiction, he was forced to confront questions that others avoided. How could objects that cannot speak, hear, or act be worthy of devotion? Why did people submit to forces that clearly lacked power? Why did fear dominate where truth should have been? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They were existential tensions embedded in daily life. And it is precisely within this darkness that the first spark of authentic faith begins to emerge. Faith, in Abraham's story, does not originate in clarity or comfort. It is born in confusion, in tension, in the unsettling realization that something is fundamentally wrong. The false stability of becomes the catalyst for internal awakening. The very system designed to suppress questioning instead provokes it in him. This is a crucial insight. True faith often begins not with answers, but with disruption. Abraham's environment, filled with illusion and control, becomes the necessary backdrop against which truth can be recognized. Without the darkness of false belief, the light of genuine faith would not be visible. His story demonstrates that awakening does not occur in isolation from error. It often emerges directly through confrontation with it. Thus, the world of is not merely a historical setting, it is a symbolic landscape. It represents any system, ancient or modern, that prioritizes conformity over truth, fear over understanding, and appearance over reality. And Abraham's early life within that system sets the stage for what will become one of the most significant spiritual transformations in human history. From this tension, from this paradox of illusion and awareness, a new path begins to form, one that will require not certainty, but courage, not perfection, but persistence. Out of this environment of contradiction and silent tension, something begins to shift within Abraham. The questions that had quietly formed in his mind can no longer remain unspoken. What others accepted without reflection, he begins to examine with unsettling clarity. The idols surrounding him, objects of devotion for an entire mujtama, start to appear not sacred, but absurd. Then comes the decisive moment. Abraham enters the space where these idols are kept, figures carefully crafted, positioned, and revered. These are not just objects, they are symbols of authority, of tradition, of a system that governs thought and behavior. And in an act that is both simple and revolutionary, he destroys them. This is not merely an act of rebellion, it is an act of intellectual and spiritual rupture. When confronted, Abraham does not retreat into fear or denial. Instead, he responds with a question that cuts to the core of the entire system. If these idols cannot defend themselves, cannot speak, cannot act, why should we worship them? This question is devastating in its simplicity. It exposes the illusion that everyone else has chosen to ignore. It reveals that what has been accepted as sacred is, in reality, powerless. And more importantly, it shifts the foundation of belief from external authority to internal reasoning. This is the true turning point. For the first time, faith is no longer defined as passive submission. It becomes an active pursuit of truth. Abraham moves from obedience without understanding to conviction grounded in awareness. He is no longer following what has been handed down to him. He is seeking what is Wakari. This transition marks the birth of a new kind of faith, a faith that is not blind, but conscious, a faith that is not imposed, but chosen, a faith that does not fear questions, but is refined by them. What makes this moment so significant is not just the destruction of idols, but the dismantling of an entire epistemological framework. Abraham challenges the assumption that tradition guarantees truth. He demonstrates that inherited belief must be examined, not merely accepted. And this carries a powerful implication. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. It is often its beginning. In many narratives, doubt is portrayed as weakness, as something to be overcome or suppressed. But here, doubt becomes the catalyst for transformation. Without questioning, Abraham would have remained within the system of illusion. Without the courage to confront inconsistency, he would never have discovered a deeper reality. True faith, then, does not emerge from certainty. It emerges from the willingness to question what appears certain. This is the message embedded in this moment. Authentic belief is not built on fear of inquiry, but on the courage to pursue truth, even when that pursuit disrupts everything familiar. Abraham's act is not just historical, it is archetypal. It represents the moment when a human being chooses truth over comfort, awareness over conformity. And once that choice is made, there is no return to the old way of seeing. Having broken away from the illusions that once defined his world, Abraham now stands in a space that is both liberating and terrifying. The old structures are gone. The familiar beliefs have been dismantled. But what replaces them is not immediate clarity, it is uncertainty. And it is precisely at this moment that the call comes. God speaks to Abraham with a command that defies every conventional expectation. Leave your homeland, your family, and everything you know. There is no detailed explanation, no mapped destination, no clear timeline, only a directive to go. At the age of 75, when most individuals seek stability and continuity, Abraham is asked to abandon it entirely. This is not a minor adjustment. It is a total disruption of identity, security, and orientation. In the ancient world, one's land and family were not just possessions, they were the very foundation of existence. To leave them was to step into vulnerability on every level. And yet, Abraham goes. This is where faith takes on a new dimension. It is no longer confined to thought or conviction. It becomes action. What makes this moment so profound is the absence of information. Abraham does not know where he is going. He does not know how the journey will unfold. He does not even know what the Connectioner cell will look like. There is no strategic plan, no calculated outcome, no guarantee of success. There is only trust. This transforms the concept of faith from belief into movement. It is not about agreeing with an idea, it is about stepping forward without having all the answers. Abraham's journey becomes a living expression of what it means to act under uncertainty. The journey itself is deeply symbolic. To leave one's homeland is to detach from the structures that provide identity and control. To walk into the unknown is to accept that certainty is not a prerequisite for meaning. Abraham's movement represents a fundamental shift, from a life defined by external stability to a life guided by internal conviction. Every step he takes is a confrontation with fear. Every mile traveled is a rejection of the need for control. Every decision to continue is an affirmation that faith is not dependent on clarity. This is the essence of the message. Faith is not the absence of uncertainty, it is the willingness to act within it. In modern terms, we often equate action with planning, with analysis, with risk management. We move when we understand. We commit when outcomes are predictable. But Abraham's story inverts this logic. He moves first, and understanding follows, if it comes at all. This inversion is what makes his journey so radical. It suggests that waiting for complete clarity may, in fact, prevent movement altogether. That the demand for certainty can become a barrier to transformation. Abraham does not wait for the path to be visible. He walks, and the path emerges through the act of walking. This is not irrationality. It is a different kind of rationality. One that recognizes the limits of human foresight and chooses to proceed anyway. Thus, the call to leave is not just a geographical relocation, it is a redefinition of how life is approached. It is an invitation to live without the illusion of control, to embrace vulnerability as a necessary condition for growth, and to understand that meaning is often discovered not at the destination, but along the journey itself. In this way, Abraham becomes more than a historical figure. He becomes a model of existential courage, a person who steps into the unknown not because he is certain, but because he is willing. And that willingness is what transforms a simple journey into the foundation of a legacy that will echo across generations. As the journey continues, the narrative refuses to idealize Abraham. If the earlier stages established him as a man of courage and conviction, what follows deliberately reintroduces tension, not from the outside world, but from within. The same individual who shattered idols and stepped into the unknown now encounters a different kind of confrontation, his own fear. When Abraham and his household arrive in Egypt, the environment shifts again. Egypt represents power, structure, and potential danger. It is a place where vulnerability can be exploited, where outsiders are exposed to forces beyond their control. And in this context, Abraham makes a decision that reveals the fragile side of his faith. He tells a lie. Fearing that his life may be threatened because of his wife's beauty, he instructs her to present herself as his sister rather than his wife. This is not a calculated theological decision. It is a survival instinct. It is the response of a man who, despite everything he has experienced, still feels the weight of fear pressing against his judgment. This moment is crucial because it dismantles any illusion that faith eliminates human weakness. Abraham does not suddenly become immune to anxiety or self-preservation. He does not operate with flawless moral clarity. Instead, he reacts in a way that is deeply human, seeking to protect himself, even if it means compromising truth. This is not the behavior of an idealized figure. It is the behavior of a real person navigating uncertainty under pressure. And this is precisely why the moment matters. If Abraham had remained consistently strong, consistently fearless, his story would become distant, unrelatable. But here, his vulnerability brings him closer to the human condition. It exposes the tension between belief and instinct, between trust and fear. It shows that faith does not override emotion. It exists alongside it. This leads to a critical insight. Fear does not invalidate faith. In many frameworks, fear is treated as evidence of weak belief. But Abraham's story suggests something more nuanced. Fear is not the absence of faith. It is the environment in which faith operates. The presence of fear does not mean that belief has failed. It means that belief is being tested under real conditions. The defining factor is not whether fear exists, but how one responds to it. Abraham's failure in Egypt does not mark the end of his journey. It becomes part of it. His mistake does not disqualify him. It deepens the narrative. It introduces consequences, complexity, and growth. Faith, in this sense, is not a static state of perfection. It is a dynamic process that includes missteps, corrections, and istimrar. What ultimately distinguishes Abraham is not that he never falters, but that he does not stop moving. After the failure, he continues. He does not abandon the path, nor does he retreat into paralysis. The journey resumes, carrying with it the memory of error and the opportunity for transformation. This persistence is what defines authentic faith, not the absence of failure, but the refusal to let failure become final. Thus, the message becomes clear. True faith is not demonstrated in moments of certainty, but in the decision to keep going when certainty collapses. It is not about never being afraid, but about refusing to let fear dictate the final outcome. Abraham's crisis in Egypt reveals a deeper truth about the human experience. Belief does not remove vulnerability. It gives meaning to the act of continuing despite it. As the narrative progresses, a noticeable shift begins to take place. The Abraham who once reacted MTVKH fear now begins to operate MTVKH principle. This transformation does not happen instantly, nor does it erase his earlier daf. Instead, it builds upon it. The lessons of uncertainty, failure, and istimrar start to converge into something more stable: character. This evolution becomes evident in a moment of external conflict. When a coalition of kings wages war and captures members of Abraham's extended family, including his nephew, the situation demands action. This is no longer a private struggle of belief. It is a public crisis requiring leadership, strategy, and courage. Abraham is no longer just a traveler responding to a call. He becomes a leader responsible for others. And he acts. He organizes a response, forms alliances, and leads a mission to rescue those who have been taken. This is a decisive shift from passive movement to active responsibility. Abraham steps into a role that requires not only faith, but judgment, coordination, and risk-taking. He engages in conflict not for conquest, but for justice, for the protection of life and the restoration of what has been lost. This moment reveals a new dimension of faith. It is not only internal conviction, but external action aligned with moral purpose. Yet the most revealing part of this episode occurs after the victory. Having succeeded in rescuing his family and recovering significant wealth, Abraham is offered the spoils of war. By all conventional standards, he has earned them. Accepting the reward would be justified, even expected. It would enhance his status, secure his resources, and reinforce his position. But he refuses. This refusal is not symbolic. It is principled. Abraham explicitly declines the material gain, stating that he will not allow anyone to claim that his success was the result of human provision. In doing so, he separates his identity from wealth, his purpose from possession. He chooses not to be defined by what he can acquire, but by what he upholds. This is integrity in its purest form. Integrity is not merely honesty in speech. It is consistency in value, especially when deviation would be advantageous. Abraham's decision demonstrates that leadership is not measured by accumulation, but by restraint. He has the power to take and chooses not to. This redefines the concept of power itself. In many systems, power is equated with control over resources, influence, and outcomes. It is something to be expanded, protected, and displayed. But Abraham introduces a different paradigm. Power is revealed in how it is used, not in how much is possessed. The ability to act without being driven by gain becomes the true indicator of strength. This marks a significant maturation. The man who once acted out of fear now acts MTVKH conviction. The individual who once sought to protect himself at all costs now prioritizes justice and principle over personal benefit. This does not mean that fear has disappeared, but that it no longer governs his decisions. Something deeper, more stable, has taken its place. Leadership, in this context, is not about dominance. It is about responsibility anchored in ethical clarity. Abraham's growth illustrates that faith, when sustained through uncertainty and refined through failure, produces not perfection, but alignment. His actions begin to reflect a coherence between belief and behavior. What he trusts internally begins to shape what he does externally. And this is the ultimate message of this stage. True power is not what you hold, but how you choose to act when holding it. Abraham's journey, therefore, continues to evolve, not toward flawlessness, but toward integrity. And it is this integrity, forged through both weakness and courage, that prepares him for the even greater Ispitania that lie ahead. By this stage in the journey, Abraham has already demonstrated courage, endured uncertainty, and begun to mature into a leader shaped by principle. Yet the next phase introduces a tension that goes beyond external conflict or internal fear. It confronts him with something far more destabilizing, a promise that contradicts reality itself. God brings Abraham outside under the vast night sky and speaks words that seem, at first, impossible. Look at the stars, so shall your descendants be. On the surface, the image is powerful, limitless, expansive, filled with potential. But within Abraham's lived context, it is also profoundly irrational. He is old. His wife is old. The biological window for having children has long passed. There is no evidence, no precedent, no natural pathway through which this promise could be fulfilled. This is not merely a difficult promise, it is an absurd one. And this is precisely where the nature of faith shifts again. Up to this point, faith has involved action under uncertainty, leaving one's homeland, continuing despite fear, acting with integrity. But now, faith is required to operate in direct contradiction to observable reality. It is no longer about what cannot yet be seen, but about what cannot reasonably be expected at all. This introduces a new dimension, faith that transcends logic. It is important to clarify that this does not imply irrationality in the sense of abandoning thought altogether. Rather, it represents an acknowledgement of the limits of human reasoning. Logic operates within known parameters: age, biology, probability. Faith, in this moment, extends beyond those parameters, not by denying them, but by refusing to be confined by them. Abraham stands between two interpretive frameworks. One grounded in empirical reality, age, time, limitation. One grounded in divine assertion, promise, possibility, transcendence. He cannot reconcile them through analysis. There is no equation that resolves the contradiction. The only available response is a decision to trust or to dismiss, and he chooses to trust. This choice does not eliminate the tension. It does not provide immediate understanding. What it does is reposition Abraham within the paradox. He accepts that the fulfillment of the promise will not come through conventional means. He allows the possibility that reality may be larger than what is currently visible. This is the point at which faith reaches what can be described as a supra-rational level. It does not reject reason, it surpasses it. It acknowledges that there are dimensions of existence that cannot be fully accessed through logic alone. In this sense, faith becomes not the opposite of reason, but its extension into areas where reason cannot yet operate. The symbolism of the stars reinforces this idea. Stars are distant, unreachable, and numerous beyond counting. They represent both vastness and mystery. To align one's future with such an image is to accept that the outcome will exceed comprehension. This moment reshapes Abraham's internal orientation. He is no longer navigating uncertainty alone. He is now carrying a promise that cannot be verified, only believed. The future is no longer just unknown. It is, by all visible measures, impossible. And yet, he continues, this leads to a critical insight. Faith often begins where logic reaches its limit, not because logic is insufficient in itself, but because reality may extend beyond what logic can currently explain. Abraham's willingness to inhabit this tension without collapsing into doubt or denial becomes a defining feature of his journey. However, this tension does not remain abstract. It exerts pressure over time, and that pressure sets the stage for the next development, one that reveals the fragility of even the strongest convictions. As time passes, the promise remains unfulfilled. The stars continue to shine, but no child is born. The gap between what was promised and what is experienced begins to widen, and within that gap, a familiar force re-emerges: impatience. This is where the narrative takes a critical turn. Sarah, Abraham's wife, proposes an alternative. If the promise cannot be realized through natural means, perhaps it can be achieved through a human arrangement. She offers her servant, Hagar, as a surrogate. The logic is straightforward, pragmatic, and culturally acceptable within that context. It provides a solution where none appears to exist, and Abraham agrees. This decision is not driven by rebellion against God, but by a desire to resolve the tension. It is an attempt to bridge the gap between promise and reality using available means. In many ways, it is understandable. Faced with prolonged uncertainty, the human impulse is to act, to fix, to bring closure. But this is precisely where the distinction between faith and control becomes critical. By choosing this path, Abraham shifts from trusting the promise to managing its outcome. He moves from waiting to intervening, from believing to constructing. The result is the birth of Ishmael, a child born not from the fulfillment of the promise, but from the effort to accelerate it. At first glance, the solution appears effective. A son is born. The immediate problem is resolved. But beneath the surface, a deeper consequence begins to unfold. The decision introduces tension into the Al-Usra. Relationships become strained. Questions of inheritance, identity, and legitimacy emerge. What was intended as a solution becomes the source of long-term conflict that extends beyond a single generation. This is not merely a personal misstep, it is a structural divergence. The narrative highlights a fundamental difference between two approaches. Faith, which waits, trusts, and allows fulfillment to emerge in its own time. Human strategy, which acts, constructs, and seeks immediate resolution. The danger of the second is not that it is inherently wrong, but that it may bypass the deeper process required for the promise to be fully realized. It replaces patience with productivity, and in doing so, alters the outcome in ways that cannot be easily undone. Abraham's decision reveals an important truth. Even those who operate at a high level of faith are not immune to the pressure of time. The longer a promise remains unfulfilled, the stronger the temptation to intervene. And this is where the lesson becomes especially relevant. Impatience is not just a personal weakness, it is a force that can reshape trajectories. A single decision made to alleviate tension can generate consequences that persist across years, even centuries. In this case, the choice to pursue a human solution introduces a line of conflict that will echo far beyond Abraham's immediate context. Yet, as with earlier failures, this moment does not end the story. It complicates it, it deepens it, it introduces consequences that must now be integrated into the broader journey. Abraham is once again confronted with the reality that faith is not a linear progression toward perfection. It is a path marked by deviation, correction, and continued movement. The key distinction remains: he does not stop. He does not abandon the promise, even after attempting to fulfill it on his own terms. He continues forward, now carrying not only the original tension, but also the consequences of his intervention. And this reinforces the central message of this stage. When patience collapses, the results may extend far beyond the moment. Faith requires not only belief in what is promised, but restraint in how that promise is approached. Abraham's failure, therefore, is not simply a mistake, it is a revelation. It exposes the limits of human solutions when applied to divine timing. And in doing so, it prepares the ground for the next phase, where fulfillment will arrive, not through strategy, but through something entirely unexpected. After years of tension, missteps, waiting, and unresolved contradiction, the narrative reaches a moment that redefines everything that came before. At an age when life is typically winding down rather than beginning anew, Abraham becomes a father. At 100 years old, with his wife long beyond the natural capacity for childbirth, the promise that once seemed absurd finally materializes. Isaac is born. This is not merely the arrival of a child, it is the convergence of promise and fulfillment, the resolution of a tension that has stretched across decades. Every moment of doubt, every attempt to intervene, every instance of waiting now collapses into a single, undeniable reality. What was declared impossible has occurred. The significance of this event lies not only in its miraculous nature, but in its timing. The delay was not incidental, it was integral. Had the child been born earlier, the narrative could have been explained through natural progression. There would have been room for interpretation, for attributing the outcome to probability or biological variance. But the prolonged delay eliminates those alternatives. It ensures that the fulfillment cannot be reduced to human explanation. It forces a confrontation with the idea that some outcomes exist beyond predictable systems. This is where the symbolism of Isaac's name becomes essential. Isaac means laughter. But this laughter is layered. It is not simply joy, it is transformation. It echoes an earlier moment when Sarah laughed in disbelief at the idea of bearing a child in old age. That laughter carried skepticism, even quiet resignation. It was the sound of logic asserting its limits. Now, that same laughter returns, but altered. It becomes the expression of astonishment fulfilled. What was once dismissed as impossible is now held in her arms. The laughter that once questioned now affirms. It marks the transition from doubt to realization, from tension to release. In this way, Isaac embodies more than a fulfilled promise. He embodies the journey from uncertainty to trust. And this leads to a critical message. Delay is not equivalent to denial. In human perception, time often functions as a measure of failure. The longer something takes, the less likely it seems. Expectations are shaped by immediacy, by visible progress. When outcomes do not align with these expectations, doubt intensifies. But Abraham's story challenges this framework. The delay was not evidence of abandonment. It was part of the process through which the promise gained its full meaning. The extended waiting period stripped away alternative explanations, deepened reliance, and ultimately amplified the significance of the outcome. Faith, in this context, is not validated by speed, but by endurance. Isaac's birth, therefore, is not just a conclusion, it is a revelation. It demonstrates that what appears stagnant may still be unfolding beneath the surface, that what seems impossible may simply require a different scale of time. Yet, just as the narrative resolves one tension, it introduces another, one that will push faith to its absolute limit. The arrival of Isaac should, by all expectations, mark the end of the journey's difficulty. The promise has been fulfilled, the tension has been resolved, stability should follow. But instead, the narrative takes its most severe turn. God issues a command that disrupts everything. Abraham is to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. This is not merely a difficult instruction, it is a direct contradiction of the promise itself. Isaac is not just a son, he is the embodiment of everything that has been promised. To lose him is to lose the future, the legacy, the meaning of the entire journey. This creates the most intense conflict in the narrative: faith versus paternal love. Up to this point, Abraham has been asked to leave, to trust, to wait. But now, he is asked to surrender the very thing that justified all previous sacrifices. The test is no longer external or circumstantial, it is existential. And yet, he proceeds. The journey to the mountain unfolds over 3 days. This duration is not incidental, it amplifies the psychological weight of the command. Every step forward is a step deeper into tension. There is time to reconsider, to resist, to reinterpret. There is space for doubt to expand. But Abraham continues. The silence of these 3 days is as significant as any spoken word. There is no recorded argument, no visible negotiation. What remains is movement, steady, deliberate, unresolved. When they arrive, the scene intensifies. The altar is built. The wood is arranged. Isaac, the child of promise, stands at the center of an act that defies comprehension. The narrative narrows to a single moment. Abraham raises the knife. This is the point at which everything converges. Logic has already been surpassed. Emotion is at its breaking point. The promise itself hangs in suspension. There is no framework left to interpret the action. And then, interruption. At the exact moment when the act is about to be completed, Abraham is stopped. The sacrifice is halted. A substitute is provided. Isaac lives. This resolution does not erase the tension. It reveals its purpose. The test was never about the loss of Isaac. It was about the extent of Abraham's trust. It was about whether faith could persist even when it appeared to negate itself, whether obedience could remain intact in the absence of understanding. This is the highest expression of faith within the narrative. It is not faith that seeks clarity, nor faith that depends on favorable outcomes. It is faith that acts without resolution, that holds tension without collapse, that moves forward even when meaning is not immediately accessible. The message is stark. True faith transcends both logic and emotion. It does not deny them, but it is not governed by them. It operates in a dimension where trust is not contingent on explanation, and obedience is not dependent on comfort. This moment defines Abraham not simply as a man of belief, but as a figure who embodies the extremity of trust. And in doing so, it transforms his story from a personal journey into a paradigm that will resonate across generations. Looking back across the entire journey of Abraham, a pattern emerges, one that resists simplification. He was not flawless. He doubted, feared, intervened prematurely, and made decisions that carried lasting consequences. He experienced moments of clarity and moments of confusion. His path was not linear, nor was it consistently strong. And yet, he did not stop. This is the defining characteristic that unifies every stage of his story, from the destruction of idols to the departure into the unknown, from the failure in Egypt to the refusal of material gain, from the acceptance of an irrational promise to the misstep with Hagar, from the long intithar to the birth of Isaac, and finally to the unimaginable test on the mountain. Each phase contributes to a trajectory that is not defined by perfection, but by persistence. His journey can be understood as a progression, from ignorance to awareness, from awareness to action, from action to failure, from failure to growth, from growth to Ispitania, from Ispitania to legacy. What transforms this progression into something enduring is not the absence of weakness, but the continuity of movement. Abraham's legacy, therefore, is not that he never fell, it is that he never abandoned the path. This leads to the final and perhaps most important message. God does not choose those who are already complete. He chooses those who are willing to continue, willing to question, willing to step into uncertainty, willing to fail and rise again, willing to trust beyond understanding. In a world that often demands immediate clarity, flawless performance, and predictable outcomes, Abraham's story offers a different model. It suggests that meaning is not found in control, but in commitment. That greatness is not achieved through perfection, but through endurance. His life becomes a testament to a simple but profound truth. Faith is not about having all the answers. It is about continuing the journey when answers are absent. And it is this istimrar, this refusal to stop, that transforms an ordinary man into a figure whose story continues to shape the way billions understand belief, purpose, and the courage to move forward.